Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Jacobs. Today we are going to be talking about Module 7, which is neurobiology and grief. So let's get started. So it feels important to begin this conversation by talking about what grief is. Um, of course, that really needs to be an entire class of its own, but a quick overview about grief. Grief is a normal response to loss, such as the death of a loved one. It can involve a range of emotions, including sadness, yearning, confusion, or apprehension. Grief can also cause physical distress. I want to note that grief is not only when we lose someone to death. Loss happens throughout life in many situations and times. According to the APA, grief often includes physiological distress, separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, obsessive dwelling on the past, and apprehension about the future. Intense grief can become life-threatening through disruption of the immune system, self-neglect, and suicidal thoughts. Grief may also take the form of regret for something lost, remorse for something done, or sorrow for a mishap to oneself. So, a lot of this lecture is going to focus on Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, who's an incredible researcher and whose research has really focused on grief, attachment, and neurobiology. So you're going to read work by Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor within this class and in this module. And as I mentioned, she has spent, her career studying this. In an interview, Dr. O'Connor explains that they looked at grief and grieving as two different things. This is a quote from Dr. O'Connor. Quote, "Grief really is that feeling that you have, the sort of intensity that just overwhelms you, and that sort of momentary experience. Grieving, on the other hand, is the way that grief changes over time without ever actually going away. For example, the first 100 times you get knocked off your feet by that feeling of grief, that wave of grief, the 101st time, it may be just as awful, but it may also be familiar, so that now you may have some ways to comfort yourself, or you may know how to reach out to someone in that moment. Even though the feeling hasn't necessarily changed, our relationship to the feeling changes over time. And the reason that people have found this to be useful is that if we expect that we're not going to feel grief in the future, that somehow it's going to be over, then we'll be disappointed if years later, even decades later, we come across something and suddenly we get all teared up and we have that wave of grief. That doesn't mean that we've done anything wrong in our grieving process. It just means that in the moment, we're aware of the loss of something really important. So, to continue to talk about Dr. O'Connor, in their research, they talk about how losing a loved one can feel like losing a part of yourself. Here's another quote from Dr. O'Connor. Um, and in this quote, Dr. O'Connor is talking about a loss of connection and why we experience um, loss in the way that we do. Think about here's the quote, to think about what happens when we lose a loved one, you have to first recognize that the brain encodes a bond. When you fall in love with your spouse or with your child, the brain encodes this bond. Essentially, it creates a we, not just a you and me, but it creates a we of overlapping experience. Because of that, then, when a loved one is no longer there, we actually experience it as part of us is missing, right? At the very neural and coded level, our representation of the we has a hole in it. It's not just the metaphorical way, perhaps, that we describe feeling like there's a hole in our heart. With that, then, we come to understand differently, perhaps, and can consider things like phantom limb syndrome, where people who have had an arm or part of a leg amputated, they sometimes experience itching or pain in that absent limb. We know it's because the brain has not rewired its representation of the body. We're actually experiencing sensations in the brain that aren't related to peripheral nerves. I think that we're coming to discover the way that we get encoded might mean that we continue to expect to have both parts of we. You expect to have both parts of we as we function in the world, and then experience it as a great loss, as a missing, as an absence when they're not there with us. So I just want to say that I think that those quotes from Dr. O'Connor are really impactful, and Dr. O'Connor's work is incredibly impactful. I'm going to keep talking about Dr. O'Connor. We discussed neurobiology and attachment in a prior module. Hopefully, you all remember that. Human beings are hardwired to make attachments. Our most important bonds are also permanently and deeply encoded in the brain, like Dr. O'Connor just talked about, which develops the implicit knowledge that certain people are special to us and will always be with us. And again, everything I'm talking about now is Dr. O'Connor's research. Um, this encoding happens during intense, sometimes intimate, loving moments. And then to keep track of your relationships, your brain creates a neural map. And so I'm going to be talking about more like intimate and marriage-based things, but this is the same for parent-child, friendship, all different kinds of relationships. But let's say in an intimate or a marriage-like relationship. So the neural map for a marriage or a long-term partnership contains detailed information about your partner, your relationship, and your life together. Especially if you and your partner have been connected for a long time, your brain has acquired a lot of lived experience, and you have a very comprehensive neural map. And then that neural map is used to predict and make sense of what's going on in each moment. And thanks to that neural map, your brain requires very little power or computing power needed to navigate life. So instead of each moment being a shock or unexpected with loads of new things to negotiate, life flows easily and it's, predictable, and you have customary habits and realistic expectations, and life is familiar and hopefully safe. So then when your partner dies or the relationship unexpectedly ends, your grieving brain has to learn how to make sense of their absence and redraw the neural map to reflect this new reality. This is particularly challenging and traumatic if the absence happens suddenly or with little warning, or if you expected and counted on spending many more years together. This learning process is huge and complicated. Um, Specifically, your brain can struggle to reconcile two opposing pieces of knowledge: the conscious knowledge that they are gone and the powerful implicit knowledge that they are everlasting. And that's what Dr. O'Connor talks about. The struggle explains some of the more really difficult, crazy pieces of grieving. And this is where the neurobiology piece comes in. To settle the dispute between gone and everlasting, a lot of cultures support individuals in expressing their continued bond by finding ways to maintain a connection that's meaningful and comforting, and every culture is different. And that's where a grief class, I think, would be really beautiful to talk about that part. Um, So for many months, even though someone knows their relationship has changed, the brain's neural map lags behind because the brain favors the implicit knowledge that the partner is everlasting, and the map just doesn't get updated because they're gone for a day or 7 months. The brain requires significant time and rumination and lived experience to absorb the absence, to update that predictable schedule we were talking about, and to redraw it. So in the meantime, the outdated areas of the neural map make someone who's grieving think and feel and act even like the loved one is still here and now and close. So the grieving individual is still grieving every time they're confronting that outdated um, neural map. So this research by Dr. O'Connor has really been a game changer in how grief and neurobiology are connected. So that is our conversation for today. The last, slide is just references. Thank you all for listening. And I hope that you all, have a really good evening. Thanks.